some of you, I think, on the call today, the meeting today, I should say, actually participated in aspects of that, because we've been holding listening sessions all around the state with different communities to learn more about what you all want and need and have interest in terms of the semi-quincentennial. So we're working, that long-range plan, by the way, for the initiative will wrap up in the early fall. And the other structural work that we've been doing is to kind of figure out what kind of a structure we could put together for us to work together on this. So that's what you see here represented right now in this slide. I'm going to note that the bubble off to the left in green is our honorary board, and we are working with the governor's office and the Secretary of State's office to populate that honorary board. So we look forward to announcing that, to be able to announce that to you soon. And then, as you'll see on the right-hand side, at the top of the structure are the Historical Commission and Crossroads. We've pulled representatives from each of those to be a steering committee so that we can be a little bit more nimble and be able to maneuver through this a little bit more easily. So that steering committee has 2 representatives from each of those entities who will then report back to their respective boards. And then right underneath that steering committee is the advisory council. And we're going to have the first meeting of that body next week. We're really excited about that. We've assembled a group of scholars and practitioners and that we think is really diverse and representative of all parts of our state and of our community. So we're excited to get them started, to give us advice on how we put together programs and initiatives for this anniversary. And then Janice, maybe I could ask you to talk a little bit about that campaign council, which is off there on the left.
Sure.
You want to say a few words about the campaign council and what that group will do?
Can you hear me?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So the campaign council is an initiative to try to raise the funds that are going to be needed for a lot of what is outlined in the report. Obviously, we can't raise all of that, but what we are hoping to do is have that campaign council be representatives of individuals, corporations, foundations that are interested in this effort, that are going to help with that fundraising. And we hope to be populating that very shortly. COVID-19 delayed us a little bit. The thought was once the report was issued that we would move forward with that. And I do see that Sally Lane, our board chair, who is also on the steering committee, is here. Sally, I didn't know if you wanted to make any other comment about the campaign council briefly.
Thanks. No, I don't think it's necessary. We are working hard on populating it. We're waiting to hear from what we hope will be the honorary chair, and we're getting somewhere on that. So soon, we hope.
Great.
Thanks, Sal. So Greer, if you don't mind, take us to that next slide. So here's a little more articulate statement of these different parts of our governance structure, which you can see there. So our honorary board, our steering committee, and I'll just pause for a few more seconds so you can read. And then Greer, why don't you take us to the next slide? And here's our advisory council. So I'm really pleased and delighted to share this with all of you. We have co-chairs for this body, and the co-chairs will be Linda Epps and Kristen Obrazil-Culfin. So they are 2 dynamic history leaders in our state, and we're just so grateful and delighted that they were willing to take on this task. And then you can see the other names. And what we've tried to do is assemble a group of individuals who really represent many different aspects of the history community here in New Jersey. So you can see we've got tourism, we've got the National Park Service, we've got universities, we've got libraries represented. So we hope you are as excited as we are about getting this group going. And as I mentioned, they're going to start meeting next week. So Greer, the next slide, please. There we are. So at that meeting next week, we will get the group oriented and start working on an interpretive framework. I know some of you in previous meetings have been asking for that, which makes me really pleased that everyone's excited to really wrap their hands around the interpretive framework that we will have for our activities here. And then the next thing they're going to look at is creating a set of working groups who will really be getting down into the nitty-gritty of it and putting together the programs and initiatives for the anniversary. So those working groups are not formed yet, but we're going to be working on them intensively with the advisory council starting next week. And our next slide. Now, before I introduce our featured speaker, I want to just add that we did also have a really exciting Scholars Summit earlier in the month, and we had just a wonderfully rich conversation with a number of scholars we brought together to talk about the history of the Revolution, what it means to us today, what kinds of advice they could give us on developing those themes. So we're going to be bringing all of that great input to the advisory council and working with them to develop and refine that interpretive framework for Revolution NJ. And you know, I'll just say, does anyone, if you have questions about any of that Janice and I reviewed, feel free to put those in the chat box and we can definitely circle back to those probably at the end of the meeting today. But feel free, if you have any questions about what we just covered, happy to try to answer them. But really, I don't want to delay our speaker's presentation because I want to hear it, and I know that the rest of you do as well. Our featured speaker today is the one and only Dr. Maxine Lurie, who is Professor Emerita at Seton Hall University. She really, you know, the governor opens all his briefings and talks about our Commissioner of Health as the woman who needs no introduction, and that could apply to Maxine. She really needs no introduction because she is so well known and beloved here in New Jersey. But let me just remind you that her fields are certainly early American history, primarily of the 17th and 18th century, but she has really become known to us really as our preeminent New Jersey history scholar. She has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, an MA from the University of Rochester, a BA from Alfred University, and her publications are no doubt on the bookshelves of many of you on this call. And they include, of course, the Encyclopedia of New Jersey, Mapping New Jersey, an Evolving Landscape, a New Jersey Anthology, and many more. So we're delighted that Maxine made time to join us today and talk about some of her current research into the Revolution in New Jersey. Maxine, welcome. And be sure to unmute yourself.
I have to figure out where the button is on this version of this kind of thing. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start very briefly, and I'm going to try and be brief about everything I'm going to say because I've been thinking about this project for 20 years and working on it seriously probably for about 5. So I could talk forever, but I'm going to try just to give examples so that actually I don't talk forever. Okay, I'm working on a book. I'm working on a book called Taking Sides in Revolutionary New Jersey, Caught in the Crossfire. And it's about the sides that people took in New Jersey during the Revolution. It's not a military history, it's not a chronological history, but both of them are there because you can't tell the story without them being there. But I'm concentrating on the people. And what I wanted to do today really is to talk about the things I found in my research that surprised me. I knew starting out that the war in New Jersey was a civil war. I have taught courses on New Jersey history and on the American Revolution. I've always told students, you really wouldn't want to live in New Jersey during the American Revolution. And now that I've worked on this, I think you really, really wouldn't want to live in New Jersey during the American Revolution because it really became a very nasty civil war in many ways. But what surprised me was not that, because I did know that. What surprised me was stories about the Quakers, stories about the people, the loyalists who came back, and then also about the costs of the war. The patriots, but the costs for everybody. And I don't think we've begun to figure out, really document what the costs are. But I want to talk about those three things. So I'm going to start with the Quakers. So if you think that the Quakers were all pacifists and all tried to stay neutral during the war, it's not true. It's the story when I started looking at it became much more complicated. And I also came to understand why sometimes the patriots were really not very happy about the Quakers. In 1776, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, which was the most important American Quaker governing body, issued a statement that Quakers were not only not to serve in the military as pacifists, they weren't to do anything to help. And what they essentially said was that only God could create a government and take down a government. In other words, the British government was the legitimate government. You couldn't use, or you weren't supposed to use, continental or state money. You weren't supposed to pay taxes. There were a lot of things that you really weren't supposed to do. If you really listened, you were fined for not serving, you weren't supposed to let other people pay your fines either. And there are cases where others did offer to pay the fines for Quakers. So it got, as I said, the story got more complicated. The largest number of Quakers did try to be neutral, but there were some who really didn't. And there's a group called the Free Quakers, which I had never heard about before I started this. And when I started looking at it, and we need the next, I guess we need the next slide, which, yeah, there's a statement that the Free Quakers issued in 1781. And this is just usually seen as a Pennsylvania group. Well, again, it's a Philadelphia Yearly Meeting was so important. But what I quickly realized was that all New Jersey Quakers were part of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. They all reported to it. They were supposed to be governed by it. So then when I started looking at the Free Quakers, I was like, I wonder if there are any New Jersey members. And when I looked at the list of the members in 1785, and I'm looking down the names, there's Isaac Collins, and after his name it says from Trenton. But when I look closer, I have found, and there's probably more than I realized, I found others. So it's not just Philadelphia, it's not just Pennsylvania, it's also New Jersey Quakers that are involved. The Free Quakers thought that you owed allegiance to the existing government, which in Pennsylvania and New Jersey was the rebel or the patriot government. And they thought that you had a right to defend yourself and to fight. And so they did. So I have two examples that I want to talk about of Free Quakers that I found to sort of flesh out some of this story. I have more examples that I found that I'll talk about in the book, but just for today, let me mention two of them so you get sort of some sense of this. The first is Isaac Collins, the man of Trenton. And Isaac Collins was a printer. He becomes the printer for the New Jersey, the revolutionary government in New Jersey, which means he publishes the money that's printed. He publishes the minutes of the legislative meetings during the war. And he also, at William Livingston's urging, publishes a newspaper. He starts a newspaper, the New Jersey Gazette, and he publishes it. As a consequence of this, Isaac Collins is disowned by the Quakers. He is removed from Quaker membership, but he continues to do those things, especially to publish the newspaper through the war. Interestingly enough, his family has a wife and a large number of children, and they remain members of the Quaker meeting throughout the war. He becomes a member of the Free Quakers, as I said, when it's formed, and remains a member until, it's after the war is over, maybe 1785 or 1786, and the Free Quakers sort of last all the way into the 1820s and later, but fewer and fewer and fewer members. But then he is asked to apologize to the Quakers. He apologizes and is reinstated as a Quaker. And there's a lot of other examples of people who the same thing happens. Okay, what's really interesting about Isaac Collins is it's not that he picked up arms, it's that anything you did to help the rebel government counted as not being a proper Quaker. Okay, my other example is Israel Shreve, who became a colonel in the Continental Army. Not only did he serve, but so did his brothers, and so did his son. So basically the whole family. Shreve was also disowned by the Quakers. He served for 6 years throughout the war, and he served in New Jersey. He served in the Mohawk Valley in the campaign against the Indians. As I said, he really served. He served throughout the war. At one point, he's the officer in charge when two men who've been accused of treason were actually executed. And the Quaker that he was, fighting was okay. That he dealt with that. It was his unit that was part of those who mutinied in 1781, and he was unable to confront the mutineers. Washington was furious at him. Shreve sort of apologized. He said, I just can't. He could not fire on his own men, and he resigned the next day. So limits of being, I guess, a Quaker who's a military leader. Shreve and his whole family move west when the war is over. They do not remain in New Jersey. So, and that becomes part of the story too. Okay, we should go on to the next example. Greer, the next slide. Next, okay, thank you. All right. So the next category of people that surprised me were the loyalists who returned. Again, I've taught courses on the Revolution. I used a book about a recent book about the loyalists who left with the Revolution, who became exiles. It estimated that, and I think it's probably pretty common now, about 500,000. There were about 500,000 loyalists in all of the American colonies, and out of the 500,000, about 75,000 left at the end of the war, that they became exiles. I had a graduate student who did the math in his head faster than I could, and he was, Professor Lurie, if 75,000 left, that means 425,000 stayed. So those who stayed are really interesting too. But there's also those who returned. And some of the estimates are that maybe a third of those who left came back. And I found examples, and trying to tease it out, it's not so easy, but I have found examples of people who came back to New Jersey. And sorry, there's a wasp outside the window. There's a screen, but all right. Yeah, so one of the really interesting ones, and I think also because he's important, and I think people have sort of paid attention to him, but you pay more attention to him. The Reverend Thomas Bradbury Chandler. He was born a Congregationalist in Connecticut, went to Yale, and I'm sure to the disappointment of a lot of people at Yale, became an Anglican and went to England and became an official minister for the Anglican Church. He came back and he was the minister in Perth Amboy. With the Revolution, well, I should go before the Revolution, because that's important too. Before the Revolution, Thomas Bradbury Chandler was one of the most ferocious advocates, strongest, loudest advocates for an Anglican bishop for the American colonies. And he thought that this would help support the monarchy and help people to remain loyal to the crown. With the Revolution, he goes to England, and he's there until the war ends, until after it ends. He ends up being there for 10 years. When the war is over, Chandler is actually offered the position of being the first American colonial bishop, which would be the bishop in Nova Scotia. And he refuses. He says no, which is really very interesting. This is something that clearly he would have loved before the war. He really would wanted not only there to be a bishop, but he wanted himself to be maybe that bishop. And he says no, and says, I haven't seen my family in 8 years, and I need to go back. And it's 2 years before he returns, and he actually goes back. And part of what he says is when he left, he had a child that was an infant, and he says, I haven't seen that daughter. His son, who served the British, dies, a daughter in. The wasp is in the room. He loses a son, he loses a daughter, but he goes back. And to his great surprise, he's apparently welcomed by people in Perth Amboy. Okay, he goes on, he doesn't live that much longer, but he goes on to be important because he's one of the Anglicans, and this is led also by somebody else in New Jersey. He's one of the Anglicans who helps to organize the Episcopalian Church of the American Episcopalian Church. So the Anglican, what had been the Anglican Church, becomes now the Episcopalian Church, and he is one of the organizers. So interesting that he came back, but he's also important, and the story of what happens then after he comes back is important as well. Okay, another example I want to give, because I found it absolutely fascinating, of somebody who returns and is almost the longest to return, but I have other examples as well. But it's Stephen Kimball. And the Kimball family, the father, Peter Kimball, was a loyalist. He has, in the end, 10 children from 2 marriages. And in the end, I think I figured out 10 of them either return or stay in the United States. The daughter, Margaret, marries General Thomas Gage, and they're actually married in Christ Church in New Brunswick in New Jersey. Several of the brothers, Stephen is the one I'm going to talk a little bit more about, become British officers. Gage helps them get commissions, and they become British officers. They served during the war. Stephen Kimball serves through the American Revolution in New York, elsewhere, then in the Caribbean. He serves the British until he retires in 1805. When he retires, he's a general in the British Army. And he then returns to the family home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So he comes back, it's almost, what, 25, 30 years, or 25 years after the war is over. And he spends the rest of his life, and he lives in New Brunswick. So there's really interesting cases of these people who unexpectedly come back. And I found some of their stories absolutely fascinating. Okay, next, the surprising thing that I found was that the war, thanks, Greer. The war was really expensive. And I think my conclusion, and I got interested in the cost for patriots, but I think my conclusion in the end is that this was expensive for everyone. The war was enormously destructive. It didn't matter if you were in New Jersey and you were patriot, or you were a loyalist, or you tried to stay neutral. You could still lose property. You could still lose your lives, obviously, your children. So there's a lot of patriot leaders actually who lose children and other family members during the war. This was in all kinds of ways frightfully expensive. And I don't think we've begun to add up the costs. And almost 250 years later, I don't think we could add up all of the costs. We probably know, ironically, more about the loyalists and some of what it cost them, and a lot of people have been writing about this more recently. And the example I want to give is Bernardus Lagrange, who was a wealthy New Brunswick lawyer, lived in New Brunswick in Raritan Landing, which is in Piscataway. He was intensely disliked by people in New Brunswick because as a lawyer, he went after them for the debts that they owed to help collect debts. He was also very clearly and loudly, he was an Anglican and he was a loyalist and supported the British. He left when the Revolution started. He came back when the British were in New Brunswick and was the one apparently who went around making people take oaths of loyalty to the crown while the British controlled New Brunswick. So when they left again, he left again and went into New York. At the end of the war, Bernardus Lagrange and his children and their spouses, they all ended up either in England or Ireland or Scotland. The daughters married British officers. So that's part of the story as well. He filed a claim with the British Royal Claims Commission, and the British did spend years evaluating claims. You were more likely to get money if you were obviously literate, a man, wealthy, because you needed to have friends testify to what you had lost. And Rutgers actually has a copy of the claim that Lagrange filed, and they also have correspondence that he wrote in order to get the information to file the claim. So it's really interesting to read it. Many of the loyalists who got money were really not happy with the British. They thought that they didn't get what they deserved, that they should have got more. Some people got none, some people did get some, but no matter what they got, they were usually really not happy. Bernardus Lagrange wrote to friends in New Brunswick and the minister in New Brunswick, who was a friend. He wrote to family that lived in the Albany area. He said he was never coming back. He had no desire to come back. He says other interesting things as well. But he does write in his letters that at least he and his widowed daughter who lived with him outside of London, they had enough money from what they got from the British government to live comfortably. So at least, some people did get money if they were loyalists from the British government. Next slide. Greer? Thank you. Yes, so the other part of the story that I found, and this is the part that's really surprising and kind of interesting, is that Congress asked the states to collect information on American loyalists, and New Jersey did. And the State Archives has apparently boxes of them. So as soon as they reopened, I went to physically look at a few of them. But this is a copy of one of them. And you could, if you were a patriot, you could file claims, or even if you had tried to stay neutral, if you lived in New Jersey, you could file claims for damages. You could file claims for damages caused by the British and the Hessians, by loyalist forces, or by patriot forces. And so there are all these boxes of the claims. Well, neither the national government or the state government had any money. So none of these claims were ever paid. Loyalists sometimes got reimbursed. The patriots did not get reimbursed for their reimbursed for their losses. Also, insurance did not cover wartime damages and so on. So if you were a patriot, whatever you lost, you just had to start over, rebuild, whatever. So this particular claim I found really interesting. Benjamin Yard, he was not a wealthy man, so his claim ends up, it's like 200, it's a little over 200, and I forget if it's probably actually in continental money or state money at that point when he files it. So it's not as much as, let's say, Bernard Lagrange was asking for. But for him, this had to be a lot of money. He ran a business in Trenton. He was part of, and Richard Hunter did a lot of work on this, and this is where I got some of my information, was from the reports they filed. He was part of the new effort to produce steel and iron and weapons out of this material. So he had a shop in Trenton in which he was producing things. It was very useful for the Patriots. The problem was that the British were across the river in Philadelphia. So there is a point at which the Patriots destroy Benjamin Yard's shop because they don't want the Loyalists to be able to come across the river and everything that was there, everything that he had. So Benjamin Yard files his claim, but he does not get anything. And as far as I can tell, nobody that files any claims with the Patriots obtain anything. As I said, they just start over. That there are claims from most, but not all of the counties. So as I said, if we really wanted to try to go back and do this, there's no way. We have no way of knowing people who had losses and didn't file a claim, or why they didn't file a claim. There's no claims from Monmouth County. Clearly there was damage in Monmouth County. There's no claims from Cape May County, but armies didn't march through Cape May County, but I'm sure there were still people who had losses. So I think, these are really some of the more surprising things that I found, and they're just a few examples. There's lots more stories. And if the library's open, I hope and go back and find a few more before I finish this book and turn the manuscript down. Okay, I think the last slide, I think there's one more. Okay, so this is a map, which I found kind of interesting, from 1798. The original is in the historical collections of Barber and Howe from 1845. It's also in a later history of Newark. The little splotches that you see were my efforts to make identifying marks. Not so easy because the first is a scan, and if you move it, the dots don't move with it. So that was the best I could do so far. And you can see red I did red for Loyalist and blue for Patriot. So what I thought that was really interesting about this map is that it shows in the center of Newark, not that long after the war was over, it actually shows Loyalists and Patriots living together. And one of the more interesting of the people that are there that I talk about also in another context in the book, because he returns, is Dr. Urzel Johnson. I think that's how you pronounce the first name. He was a doctor from Newark, a loyalist. He served with the loyalist forces through the war. He was captured at Kings Mountain in South Carolina. And so he has some interesting things to say about how he was treated as a captive. Mixed treatment, but probably better because he was a doctor, and he treated people who were from both sides. If you've been injured in the battle, he helped whether you were a loyalist or a patriot. He's exchanged, and when the war is over, he actually returns to Newark, which is interesting because his property was confiscated, including all of his medicines, everything that he left behind when he had originally left Newark. And he starts over again. As he opens his medical practice, is successful enough that he has money to start buying up some property in Newark. He was an Anglican. He is a member of the Episcopalian Church in Newark when it becomes Episcopalian Church. And the minister, the Ogden minister, was also someone who had left during the war and returned. So that's interesting too. But the good doctor gets along apparently with his neighbors and contributes money to rebuild the Presbyterian Church that had been seriously damaged during the war. And the minister of the Presbyterian Church is the Reverend Alexander McWhorter, and he is one of the fiercest patriot leaders in the Revolution. So I assume that they had figured out how to live near each other and how to get along. And I think that's an interesting part of the story as well. So, you know, the only other thing I would add is my emphasis, and the people who are members of the Historical Commission have heard me say this over and over again, that I think that the Revolution was important. I think far more important the part that New Jersey, outside New Jersey, really realized. We have to figure out how to say that. I think the Revolution was important too because it made a difference. And all people who are talking about the sort of dark version of the Revolution today also need to remember that the Revolution helped establish some things that are important for us all the way down to the present. No king, at least supposedly no king. Regular elections, which were not the case before the Revolution. Religious freedom. New Jersey never had an established church. The Constitution of 1776 had provisions in it designed to make sure there never would be an established church, that there would be religious freedom. Jury trials, which were threatened by British measures before the Revolution, and more. So these are all things that I think are really significant. And the people who provided for them lived through a war that went on for 7 very long years. And I think they paid a price. And it didn't matter, again, if they were patriot or loyalist or neutral. I think everybody who lived through that war paid a price. Okay, questions?
Thank you so much, Maxine. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions for Maxine, please use our chat box. And I have one just to start us off, Maxine, and that is, it stems from part of the discussion we had with the scholars at our Scholars Summit. I think now that we're living through this pandemic, we're living through a very obviously notable moment in history. And it raises that question of, how do you know when you're in a revolution? And I recall at the Scholars Summit, you had some interesting thoughts about how they knew back in the 18th century that they were really in the middle of a revolution. So how did they?
Okay, I think they were very conscious. And not just New Jersey, but John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. I think you could look at any leader, and then William Livingston, one after another in New Jersey. I think they were very conscious that they were making history. And some of them tried to do it right. I guess could say a lot more, but so I think that's part of it. And Jonathan Dickerson Sargent was graduate of Princeton. He's thought to be the person most responsible for the wording of the Constitution of 1776. So he's important. His house is actually burnt to the ground in Princeton, so I think he knew. He ends up moving to Pennsylvania, becoming the Attorney General of Pennsylvania during the Revolution, and then staying there afterwards. But there is a point. He is helping write that Constitution of New Jersey when he writes to John Adams, who's in Philadelphia, and he says, we're about to create a republic. He knew. I think other people in New Jersey knew when an army showed up at their front door. And it could be British Army, it could be the Hessians, it could be the Patriots, it could be the Cunningham, it could be the militia. They knew when they were living through this, and some of them supported it, and some of them adamantly opposed it. And that's something else we need to keep in mind. So I've said at a commission meeting, so Sarah can chuckle when I say this again, but last fall there was a guest editorial in the Star Ledger, and the person that wrote it said, well, she wished we could go back to the Revolution when everybody agreed. Well, the real lesson of the Revolution, and I think that map is important for that reason, the real lesson of the Revolution is, no, they bitterly did not agree. They burnt each other's houses down, they captured, kidnapped, arrested, jailed each other, argued with each other, and yet the map shows at least some of them came back and learned how to live with each other when the war was over.
Oh, great. Thank you, Maxine. Now, Greer is going to help us out with questions that are coming in on the chat box. And I see that we have some. Greer, do you want to help us pose those questions to Maxine?
Sure. So it looks like we have a question from David, and I apologize, David, for I'm going to try and pronounce your last name rather Nisir. So the question is, to take up arms in the revolution implies some strong political sensibilities, including about how government, and this being a revolution society, ought to be ordered. How many remained politically active after the war? Were they more or less barred from political activity? Or was Republican politics such as they chose not to participate? And then a final kind of addition to that question, or did they find a home in the Federalist Party, which of course are not the crypto monarchists that the DR said they were, but shared some social goals? And he said he clarifies that he means loyalists here.
Okay, I would say that both sides could be very strong in their opinions and their views. So I have a chapter in my book called The Adamant Patriots, and another one called The Irreconcilable Loyalists, who left and had no desire to come back. So they could be very strong in both sides that they took. But your question is one that I certainly have thought about, and I actually gave a talk at a conference about a little over a year ago. And that was, well, what about the loyalists, and did the loyalists who stay become Federalists? And I certainly found some cases where they did. So that's really interesting. And my hunch is that if, let's say 475 loyalists, because some come back, stayed, did that make this a more conservative country in the long run? I suspect it did. So I think that's something that we really haven't sometimes thought about that is worth thinking about. On the other hand, we also need to realize that the Patriots, some of them when the war is over, William Patterson, William Livingston, These are Federalists in the 1790s. So the Patriots, the more radical ones, sometimes are the ones who become members of the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Others become members of the Federalist Party, and we move into the 1790s. It's not really a straight line. So I think what I'm saying is the answer is kind of probably a little complicated, but I do think some of the Loyalists were Federalists, and I can think of several examples, and I do try to deal with that. Okay, other questions?
Sure. So we have one more from Linda. Did your research unveil the position of free Blacks? Were they evenly divided between Loyalists and Patriots?
I couldn't tell you. I don't know. We have enough records to say they're evenly divided. But one of the interesting things I figured out and made a decision early on was to integrate both women and Blacks into the chapters as they went along. So I don't talk about them separately. So there are Blacks who are patriots and who fight for the Patriots, some of whom get their freedom and some of whom ironically don't, or do not get it until later. There also obviously are Blacks who join the Loyalists who go off to Canada. Some of them end up going from Canada to Sierra Leone. So that story becomes really interesting as well. And you can trace some from New Jersey who do join the Loyalists and then go off and leave. So what I found they were on both sides, just as I found stories about women who sometimes took the same side as their husbands, once in a while didn't, and they could be also adamant or try to straddle the sides, because I also have a chapter on the people who try and straddle the sides and just survive, either survive the war or they literally have relatives fighting on both sides, and it's very painful or difficult to pick one side or the other.
Great, thank you so much, Maxine. And what we'll do, I think, is move on to our next presentation. But Maxine, are you going to stick around with us for the rest of the?
Yeah, I will stay. I will stay, and hopefully there is a wasp in my study.
Oh dear. Okay.
I'm allergic to them, so if you saw me, like, yeah, that's why. But I'll stick around.
Very good. So if there are other questions that anyone wants to pop in there, we can always circle back at the end. So with that, Janice, I'm going to hand it off to you to introduce our next speaker.
Great. Well, as I think many of you on this call are aware, we did release the Site and Visitor Readiness Assessment on April 21st. During a virtual meeting, we had hoped to be able to do that in person, but we were able to do that. And we also provided individual site information to county officials and also to the site contacts that were designated for those individual sites. The reports are available on our website, as well as some other questions and information. So please visit the website for that information. And today we have with us Richard Hunter, who is one of the main consultants that worked on the report. He's with Hunter Research, worked along with Hargrove International and Clark Caton Hintz on the report. And I do want to address a couple of questions that came to us, ahead of time. And one I think I did talk about at the beginning when we were talking about the campaign council. The question from Paul Solstice from the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage was that the visitor readiness assessment indicated the need for millions of dollars of investments in many historic sites ahead of 2026. Do Crossroads and the Historical Commission endorse these findings? And do you have plans to secure these funds on behalf of historic sites and or support historic sites in fundraising? And I did address this with the idea that we do have a campaign council that we're in the process of populating. We do, in fact, anticipate helping with some of that fundraising, although obviously it's a lot of fundraising that will be needed. We know that we want to help with some of the capital needs and also training and resources and other opportunities there. So we will be working on that. And we are also assisting sites as they come to us and ask for letters of support as they're applying for different things. So we are working on that. The second question that Paul posed was the visitor readiness assessment suggests the establishment of historic trails on the model of Boston's Freedom Trail. How would we adapt this idea to New Jersey, which as a state has a totally different geography and infrastructure? And I'm going to start addressing that, but then I'm going to throw that to Richard. I mean, obviously, you know, we're working with the Washington Rochambeau Trail, with there's the Retreat Trail in New Jersey. We know that there are a number of trails in New Jersey that could be incorporated into this. And we do know that New Jersey is different. It might not all be walking trails. It might be some driving trails. But I would now like to let Richard address that. And then if we have some additional questions, we have Sally Lane, who's our board chair, who was involved in a lot of the work on the report for Crossroads, Sue Kaufman, Sarah Curitin, and I, along with Richard, if there are questions that people have, and also Maxine, obviously. So Richard, did you want to comment on the trail question?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Richard, now we can't hear you.
Okay, I have an echo here. It's going to be hard to respond to this, but trails. Absolutely, the Rochambeau Trail is the one that immediately comes to mind. There's other trails that are well known in the state. The Coastal Trail, for example, that's one we can tie into here. And then certainly things come to mind, such as in the Morristown area, you could put together a trail, a driving trail, that perhaps relates to the encampments and the infrastructure supporting the Continental Army that was present there. Walking trails, I'm speaking to you from Trenton here. You could put together a very nice walking trail within Trenton. So trails are certainly something that can be worked into the whole program. I hope you're not hearing the echo that I'm hearing.
No, it's perfect. Thank you, Richard.
All right.
Other questions?
Hi, hi, Richard. It's Kevin Trumbull. How are you, man?
Good morning, Kevin. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm glad to see you all. I had a couple of questions about resources in the consultation of the preparation of the report. One of the resources that made a fairly substantial effort to look at priorities for historic preservation in the state of New Jersey and around the country was the American Battlefield Protection Program 2007 report to Congress. I didn't see it in the references, and I was wondering why it wasn't included in the assessment.
Yeah, I'm certainly aware of that study, Kevin, and it should be in the references. I think that's an omission there that we should admit to.
Well, what do we do then about having the information contained therein reflected in the assessment?
Janice, would you, do we have an ability to still make modifications to the document or not?
You know, it's online and it is published in hard copy. I guess we would have to go back and talk to the team if that's something that we feel, you know, I guess it would be a question of what what needed to be added.
Okay, well, I'm happy to make some suggestions or be of any help I can in that assessment. There's quite a bit of information. It's a rather large document. And when you get down to the detail, it even outlines the kinds of National Register areas that should be considered for documentation. So it's extensive and fairly well done, I believe. So
Right, it is.
it's an important potential contribution to our overall evaluation of what we do and how we do it. I have another question in regard to the management plan of the Crossroads. There was a piece in Chapter 7 of Part 2 called Crossroads Presentation that set out 7 visitor-ready gateway sites and described a method of connecting them together as part of the Crossroads plan. I didn't see that kind of approach in this document, and I was wondering why that was not acceptable as a way to proceed.
Janice, I'm not
Yeah,
really.
I know that's not for you. I understand, and I'm sorry, I don't have an answer on that.
That's okay. We can talk about it.
Or someone else might. I don't know.
I'm happy to talk about it offline.
Well, and
Okay.
I'm going to just dive in here and just add that this assessment was always intended to be a tool, a tool for our planning and our moving forward. It is not the destination. It's just a tool to help us continue down the journey of planning. So it also was an approach to catch a snapshot from our consultants of what they saw as they visited those 150 sites. And I think that material is going to be really valuable as a tool for us to move forward with that planning. So I think that's perhaps a partial answer to your question, in that this is just a tool in the quiver that we will take into this next phase of planning. Now, Janice, I see we have another question.
It's more of a comment. I see that from Janet. Hello, Janet. And yes, I tend to agree. There's lots of different ways we could construct trails around various themes. And that's a helpful website.
And again, the assessment is not the prescription. It's the snapshot that we're going to use to develop those ultimate programmatic.
And I do want to say also that, the thought of this is that, we did hire a group of consultants, and this is the work, given what they were charged with, this is the work that was done, and it's a great place for us to move forward. And it does incorporate, some of the things obviously that existed. They were dealing with a lot of the content that did exist on our website and elsewhere, but it was not for Crossroads to be prescriptive with what they were seeing as they were going through their work.
Yeah, this is Sally Lane. I would just add that in agreement that the largest portion of this study was on individual sites as individual sites, and also on the needs for marketing, training, placing the state in a different position in tourism and in heritage tourism. So it is not, it doesn't sketch out so much how to do future things as it provides baseline information.
And I do want to just remind everyone, please feel free to use that chat box if you have a question. And we do have, of course, some folks just chiming in with a verbally, and that's fine too.
It looks like we have another question in the chat box from Paul Soltis. As you were explaining, the assessment is not necessarily instructions, only recommendations. Can you give some idea of what areas of the assessment Revolution NJ endorses and what areas may be adapted?
Let me take a stab at that if you don't mind, Janice. Do you mind?
Fine.
Okay. You know, I think that we have not taken a vote as a partnership here on what portions we're endorsing and what we're not endorsing. I think, again, I want to reemphasize that this assessment provides us with information that we're going to use to make those decisions about programs and initiatives. So, you know, that's, I think perhaps maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding of the nature of the assessment itself. It's data, it's information, it's recommendations, which now we're going to use as part of that toolbox to bring to bear in developing programs for the semi-quincentennial. So, and I, you know, turn to my other colleagues. Any other thoughts in response to Paul?
Yes, and no, I agree with that. And I think the idea is that, you know, many of the sites might not have had the ability to have this kind of an assessment done, and it could have cost a lot of money individually for them to do it. So this is a service to provide for the sites. And I think, you know, we were saying all along that nothing is, you know, supposed to be considered as a negative initiative. It's an idea of information and what could be done, you know, for the future for the sites. One of the other things, I know there are some themes that are suggested in the report as well. And, you know, we're certainly looking at those themes, but, you know, have been talking to the scholars and others around the state to develop the themes that we will actually move forward with. So I think, you know, some really good recommendations from the report for us.
And Janice, if I can add as well, we're dealing with a very, very different landscape now than we did when this project was started, you know, given the pandemic and some of the, you know, basically we're living in a different world. So, you know, that also kind of comes into play as we're looking through the data and making determinations and, you know, working with the assessed sites on moving forward.
You know, one of the great advantages too, I'll add, of this particular assessment was that we brought in a very skilled team to look at all 150 sites all at the same time. So again, the value of that current snapshot of these sites, I think is something that's really going to be an asset as we move forward.
And it looks like
I would just add one thing here, which is that in the categorization of the sites, several were identified as potentially being in the category above that they were actually assigned to.
And it looks like we have another question, a few other questions coming through the chat here. First from Cynthia Forster. As we, a county, look at the assessment and try to move forward with a plan to promote our own area with trails or other tours or inclusion of sites, is there a mechanism for keeping us in tune with your thinking and how our efforts may tie into the overall marketing of the event?
Yes. So Cynthia, that's an excellent question, and the answer is yes. And you heard in the earlier part of our presentation some discussion, for example, of the new logo and guidelines that are going to be going out soon about how that logo can be used. That's going to be just one way in which sites and counties and municipalities can tie into this, because we very much want this to be a statewide and B, a grassroots effort. We want to involve everybody. So there are going to be mechanisms offered for organizations, whether it's an individual community group or a county, to tie into this. So there'll be both marketing aspects to this. There are also, as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, we're also going to be developing interpretive themes, so that and the themes that our great team in the assessment offered are certainly, you know, a suggestion that we're going to take a look at. And we will also look at the crossroads theme from their management plan, as Kevin alluded to earlier. But those themes then are going to be a way, just as the Historical Commission has used themes in the past for other anniversaries, that's going to be another way that individual groups can design programs that are going to augment and add to the statewide activities around this anniversary. So,
right.
Yeah.
And Sarah, also Crossroads board, and I know some of your board as well, have been reaching out, or just starting to reach out to the counties, following up on some of the information, obviously, that was shared about sites in their areas. And this is just getting underway about what we can do there as well. So certainly, please, Cynthia, you know, I know we've had meetings before the report, you know, talking about what might be able to be done in Bergen, but, you know, please keep us in mind for other things that you're doing. We're going to be looking into possibilities of, you know, putting together some other trails and looking for resources to do some things that way as well. So thank you. Vicki has a question about how will the devastating economic impact of COVID affect the planning for the 250th? Many of our sites are struggling to survive right now. Funding will be difficult. How will the planning be adjusted? And, you know, obviously, you know, we were aware that, again, while the study was done, it was prior to COVID, but, you know, we have had, I think, a good reaction to the fact that we're actually hitting a lot of the areas for rebuild and restart with some of the things that have been outlined in this report. And the idea that building heritage tourism and focusing on this can really help with moving forward. And, you know, we certainly are very aware about, you know, the struggles, and are hoping one of the things that's going to come up next is some things that we can do for the sites, including the workshop that I'll talk about in a little bit, that came out of the report of the need to focus on customer service. So I think we're looking for how we can help as this moving forward, and obviously realizing that anywhere that we can talk about rebuilding after COVID, there's been a, you know, real good reaction about how this can assist with that.
I want to add one other thing to this very insightful and important question, and that is that obviously we're all in the process of responding to COVID, and as I speak to colleagues around the country, nobody has the answer yet. This is a journey that we're all on together, and one of the key strategies that right now I think we all should employ, and certainly that's what we're trying to do at the Historical Commission, and I'm sure at Crossroads too, is to provide platforms that we can continue to share information, share strategies, encourage partnerships between organizations, and learn from each other. So that is one of the strategies we're certainly employing right now. But it's a process that we're all learning together. For sure. The other element in this that I want to make sure we at least mention and make sure it's on everybody's radar is that we also have another very important national conversation going on, and that's, of course, the conversation around anti-racism. And I think it's very important that as we think about our planning too for the semi-quincentennial, we realize that this is a moment where history should play a very important and critical role in encouraging exploration of all aspects of our history and encouraging those conversations in a way that's really informed by the primary source documents, that's informed by the historical process. So I think all of that is to say that this offers us a great opportunity to serve our communities and our state in a very, very fundamental and exciting way, to be places that really carry that conversation forward.
Right. I don't know if the other question from Christine from the 3rd New Jersey Regiment, it's how is this going to affect reenactments? I don't know if that's the question about COVID-19 or whether that's a question about the planning for the 250th. And I know that part of what will happen with our advisory council is there will be various working groups, and one will be dealing with events, if that's something that you're referring to. I'm not sure if that's the question or if it's, you know, what will happen with COVID-19. So anyone else on, or maybe Chris, you could clarify your question? The planning with the 250th, yes. Okay, great. So Sarah, do you want to address a little bit on that as well? That, you know, we will have an events group that will obviously be helpful with that as well, but we're not ready yet since the overall advisory council has its first meeting next week.
Exactly. So we have sketched out just internally some working group working group model for this next phase. And Janice is absolutely right. One of those working groups that we envision is one that's going to work on events and reenactments. So that's definitely part of it, part of our planning. So Greer, did we get, by the way, I just want to say thanks, Paul. We see your comment here, and we definitely will keep all of you up to date. That's, you know, one of the purposes of this quarterly meetings is to keep the information flowing out to all of you. And we would love to get feedback from all of you about whether this is a good format, whether you would like, you know, other forms of communication, because we do want to keep that communication flow going. And
Right.
Greer, it looks like we have
the next slide. Oh,
we have another comment here too.
okay. From Linda, this is one of the times when history is repeating itself. If my memory is correct, the yellow fever outbreak and racial implications similar to what's going on now. New Jersey played an important role during the troubled time. Comment, not a question. Okay, thank you. Can we go to the next slide, Greer? Okay, so as I was saying a little bit earlier, that we, you know, in recognizing the fact that the report was released, and one of the recommendations of the report was to do more for customer service. And so we have, for those of you that have attended some of our workshops in the past, Crossroads is known for doing several workshops a year, but now due to the COVID-19 experience, we are doing this one virtually via Zoom. It'll be on July 29th. And it will be from 10 to 11:30. If you're interested, you know, we will be continuing to send out signups for that. And what's interesting about this is we are going to have Jeff Vassar, Executive Director of Travel and Tourism, Cheryl Hargrove, who is a heritage travel expert with Hargrove International, who was one of the consultants on the site assessment, and Mark Donningset, who many of you know from Middlesex County, East Jersey Old Town, who are going to help discuss visitors' readiness, how to create a first impression, and 10 ways to improve your customer service. So we think that this is going to be a really good way to help build your visitors as, you know, as sites continue to reopen, and to engage people in New Jersey's revolutionary heritage. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that workshop. Next slide.
Okay, and that's mine. So the historical, and again, just in keeping with that, that idea that we want to keep providing opportunities for all of us to learn together and look for those solutions and strategies for responding to the current needs and situations that we all confront. We are offering, this time with our partners, the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, the third installment in a webinar series that we have been offering over the last couple of months. I highly encourage you to join us. It is free, and you can find information about it on our website, I believe, as well as on the Council for the Humanities. We're going to focus here on how to really deal with the financial implications of COVID-19, how to adapt business models for nonprofit organizations to respond to the current crisis. So I really encourage all of you to join us. We've got 3 terrific speakers. Kent Whitworth is Executive Director of the Minnesota Historical Society, and just one of the folks that I personally look to for advice and leadership in the history community. He's going to be speaking, as well as Aaron Carlson Mast, who is the Executive Director of President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington, D.C., who's really also a very a real leader in the history field, with both of them with some great insights into how they have sought to navigate through these very treacherous waters with their respective institutions. And then finally, Michelle Moon will be speaking about some national trends in changing and adapting to the new environment that COVID has presented to us. So 3 great speakers. Please join us Thursday, July 23rd from 10:30 until noon. And in our last, I'm going to just grab 1 more minute to add that we also have a number of our programs for the centennial of the 19th Amendment coming up. And we really hope that you will join us for some of those. We have our bicycle slow roll has been adapted into one that you can take on your own. So look to our website and to Discover NJ History for more information about that. We have a Women's Equality Day event that'll be terrific coming up on August 26th, which will feature both the Lieutenant Governor as well as former Governor Christie Whitman and the First Lady and the Secretary of State. So please put that on your calendars. And then finally, we're going to have a whole host of digital activities coming up in October to mark both the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment and to encourage you and everyone you know to exercise that right to vote in the upcoming election, that right that so many fought so hard and continue to fight for. So with that,
I was just going to also say in the chat are some of the links for the for the Crossroads workshop on customer service, which is also free, as well as the links to what you were talking about, Sarah, just so people see that there.
Greer has put up that Discover NJ History link. We got some really exciting things coming up with that. We're commissioning 2 works of arts/humanities that'll be appearing digitally in the fall. We got some new episodes coming up of our documentary series. So please track those as well. We know we're focused in this meeting on the semi-quincentennial, but want to make sure you know about some of those other opportunities coming up. And I want to thank Joseph Smith for reminding us that partnerships will be essential moving forward. I could not agree more. It's, I think, by partnering and listening and learning from each other that really we will all navigate through this, for sure. And let's see, in our last 2 minutes, any final questions? Thank you, Barbara, for your thanks. I think we all appreciate so much everyone joining us today. I wish we could all be in a room so we could see each other more easily and have that experience. But one day we'll be back there for sure. In the meantime, please join us for our next quarterly meeting, which is at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, October 14th. And just to keep everybody on their toes, we're going to switch platforms and we'll be using Zoom for that one. So all you Zoom fans, tune in on October 14th. I want to thank particularly Richard, Hunter, and Maxine Lurie for being here with us and presenting. And look forward to more speakers coming up at our next and future quarterly meetings. And if you want to know where to find us, that's where to find us, right there on that slide. I want to note that the Historical Commission staff is still working from home. Janice, are you all?
Yeah, we are as well. We're working from home as well. And also for people to know that if they missed part of this or if they haven't listened to this, we will be posting this as we have done in the past. So from this meeting.
And I think Janice and I and our teams are always happy to field questions from any of you in between these quarterly sessions. So if you have a question about any of these projects that you want to pursue in the meantime, please let us know. We're happy to follow up. And next time we'll also perhaps update you too on the education survey, which while it was heavily impacted by COVID is moving ahead. So look forward to more reports on that one as well. All right, any final words from anyone else? All right, I want to thank everybody for being here. And Greer, I think that's a wrap.
Thank you all.